academic, a political scientist by training. I did my PhD at the Australian National University, worked in the Australian government for a couple of years, and then went overseas, worked for the UN and other international organisations for about a decade. Then came back to Australia to run a centre at the ANU, the Centre for Democratic Institutions. Then worked in Washington DC for a while, and then I've come here to Western Australia. I'm currently the Dean of the Sir Walter Murdoch School of Public Policy and International Affairs at Murdoch University, which is our graduate policy school at Murdoch. I'd often thought that conceptualisations of Australian foreign policy were missing something. Australia's a middle power. We have global interests. We have a huge interest in a kind of rule-based international order, which is a phrase that appears dozens of times in the new white paper and in the defence white paper of 2016. And obviously we have interests in the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region, which is where we're broadly located, where most of our trade goes to and from, and so on. Most of our immigrants come from. But there's a third element which is missing from a lot of contemporary conceptualisations, but was actually very much present if we go back 100 years or so, and that was the idea of Australia as a Southern Hemisphere power. Some of our early politicians really thought that Australia would be a sort of America of the Southern Hemisphere as it developed. That hasn't quite happened, but the idea of Australia as playing a leading role amongst countries of the Southern Hemisphere was very, very widely shared view about a century ago. Even Charles Darwin wrote about Australia as the sort of queen of the southern seas. But that's an idea that we've tended to forget in recent years as we've engaged with Asia. So partly it was about trying to remind people that this was an idea that has some resonance in Australian history, but also reminding people that under the world as it is today, there are a whole bunch of new opportunities for Australia in the Southern Hemisphere that we needed to take advantage of. They're actually not identical. The Global South's the Northern Hemisphere way of talking about developing countries. And so for when the Northern Hemisphere talk about the Global South, they're not thinking of Australia or indeed New Zealand. So I think the Southern Hemisphere makes more sense. It's purely geographic. We're talking about that portion of the world that exists in this hemisphere. Australia, obviously, New Zealand, Southern Africa, most of Sub-Saharan Africa, South America from Brazil downwards, so Brazil, but also large countries like Argentina, Chile, and others. But also the biggest country in the Southern Hemisphere, which is Indonesia, one of our nearest neighbours, along with Papua New Guinea. They're all Southern Hemisphere countries, and this is a part of the world that's experienced enormous economic and indeed population growth in recent decades, and so has tended to, in previous decades, the Northern Hemisphere was really where all the big powers are, but increasingly when we talk about countries like Brazil and Indonesia, we're talking about some of the major powers of the future, both in terms of demographics, but also GDP and presumably in terms of their ability to influence international affairs. Most of our engagements at present are more in the soft power realm than in the hard power realm. In terms of hard power, we obviously have one very specific hard power interest, which is in our military and particularly our naval capacity to police the Southern Ocean, which is a vast tract of water that is shared with South Africa, Argentina, Chile, New Zealand and others. And Australia has indeed played a hard power role in terms of things like policing illegal fishing in that region. It's also, interestingly, enabled us to form unusual coalitions at the international level with countries like France or the UK, who still have territories in the Southern Ocean that we assist with the policing of and naval attendance to. We also obviously have the world's largest claim over Antarctica, not recognised by our friends in the United States and Russia, but a very large claim and a very large interests, which are permanent interests. But when it comes to soft power, I think there's a lot more going on currently. And by soft power, I mean those aspects of Australia's international engagement that are more about our appeal, our values, our sense of ourselves as a modern, democratic, sophisticated country, and spreading those ideas to others. So areas like education, sporting engagements, scientific connections, even our aid program. Most of our aid goes to Southern Hemisphere countries in our region. They're all forms of soft power. The world looks very different depending on where you're standing, and it's important to display maps because they help people think mentally about our position in the world. And so as you point out, that's an unusual way of seeing Australia, and maps like that show Australia that our neighbours are countries that we may not think about so much, countries like South Africa or Argentina, where we share a connection via the Southern Ocean. The response to the paper has been quite interesting. I gave a presentation in Canberra at ASPI and have also gave some presentations here for DFAT. And because this is really, as I said, it's an old idea, but for contemporary audiences, it often is a new idea for them. People are quite intrigued, and one of the practical things that's come out of the paper is the idea from some of the DFAT officials involved that there might be some new coalitions of interest that could be built, indeed, with countries like Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, who we often forget about, but who are all G20 members. So when the G20 meeting was held in Australia, in Brisbane, 3 years ago, there were some opportunities for discussions that we probably wouldn't have thought about otherwise. Similarly, when we've held the Africa Down Under and Latin America Down Under meetings here in Perth in recent years, which has been very focused on our interest in the mining sector, so much of Australia's international mining business is located in Latin America and in Africa. And so there's actually lots of opportunities, I think, to build on this insight, both in a formal foreign policy sense, but also in business. And I mentioned science. One of the other big areas of scientific activity are things like the Square Kilometre Array, which is based here in Western Australia, a massive international project, which came about because some key astronomical investments to work effectively have to be placed in the Southern Hemisphere, cannot be in the Northern Hemisphere. And that was an example. The world's largest radio telescope needed to be in the Southern Hemisphere, and it ended up here in Western Australia. We won the bidding, we won it, we split the winning bid with South Africa, and even New Zealand has a small engagement as well. But the key was our location in the Southern Hemisphere. We already have obviously significant connections to Australia's Indian Ocean military presence, in particular via the Henderson base and our big shipbuilding operations here and others. But I think more broadly, when the rest of the world thinks about the Indian Ocean, they're really talking about the Northern Indian Ocean. They're talking about the littoral that runs from the Middle East past the Indian subcontinent, around Southeast Asia, Straits of Malacca, and so on, because that's the world's energy superhighway. That's full of potential conflict zones. Whereas for Western Australia, we need to think a little bit differently. When we think of the Indian Ocean, we should be thinking about cooperation across the Indian Ocean to Mauritius, with the Iora countries, with South Africa, and as I mentioned, with the Southern Ocean, which takes our interest down through the Kerguelen Islands and to Antarctica. So it's a different mental conception. I think the search for MH370 really, woke a few people up about just the massive scale and extent of this patch that we have on our backyard, which is one of the most under-researched and little-known parts of the world, which is the Southern Indian Ocean. So there's big opportunities for Western Australia to, I think, play a lead role. And it will play a lead role not just through the hard power interests that we mentioned, but again, soft power, joint scientific projects, oceanic research, climatic research. You know, Western Australia is linked to other Southern Hemisphere temperate and arid zones through a shared climate of the Southern Hemisphere, and that creates lots of scientific research opportunities. Because the major states are all some distance from each other, that lessens some of the obvious conflict flashpoints, and most of the issues are maritime in nature. When it comes to Antarctica, however, you have overlapping claims, and you have, as with the North Pole, the Arctic, countries like China really ramping up their investments very quickly in that part of the world, and to be honest, quickly overtaking Australia in terms of the resources that they're putting in there. So I think if there's any conflictual potential, Antarctica actually is one area where there may be, I'm not talking about armed conflict, but you know, there are very different visions of Antarctica. Some countries want to see Antarctica as a region to be exploited, to be mined. Other countries, including Australia, are really focusing on preserving it as a natural and relatively untouched part of the world. And as you say, climate change is going to affect things too. So the jury's out, but as is the case elsewhere, China and to some extent Russia as well have interests in that region that are going to challenge us in the future.